The story of Iran and Iraq is one soaked in history, power struggles, and an endless tug-of-war over identity, influence, and survival. But when people talk about recent days, what exactly are we talking about? We're not talking about the 1980s era war that left over 1 million dead. No, we're talking about the fresh tension that's been quietly simmering again, right under the world's radar. To really grasp what's happening now, we have to rewind, not to ancient Persia or Mesopotamia, but just far enough to understand the modern roots of this fragile relationship. After all, Iran and Iraq share more than just a long border. They share blood, religion, and history, but also betrayal, war, and grudges that span generations. Let's start here. Iran is a Shiite majority country, and so is Iraq, well, mostly. But during Saddam Hussein's regime, Iraq was ruled by a Sunni minority, which marginalized the Shiite population for decades. Saddam also saw Iran not just as a religious rival, but a political and strategic threat. That's why in 1980, Iraq invaded Iran, igniting one of the longest and deadliest wars of the 20th century. That war lasted 8 years. No clear winner. Just death, debt, and destruction. Now, fast forward to the early 2000s. The U.S. invades Iraq, topples Saddam, and suddenly the Shiite majority takes power. Iran? They saw this as an opportunity. The fall of Saddam opened the door for Iran to increase its influence in Iraq. And they took full advantage. Over the past 2 decades, Iran has built deep ties with Iraq's Shiite political parties and powerful militias. In fact, some of Iraq's most influential groups today are openly backed by Iran. We're talking funding, weapons, training, the works. These militias operate almost like shadow armies, and many Iraqis view them as a double-edged sword. They helped fight ISIS, but they've also undermined Iraq's sovereignty. So where are we now? In recent months, and here's where it gets tense, things have started to boil over again. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq have been accused of launching rocket and drone attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria. The U.S. has responded with airstrikes. And just like that, the region is back in that familiar cycle of retaliation. But here's the twist. This time, Iraq isn't just a battleground between Iran and the U.S., it's caught in an internal identity crisis. Young Iraqis, especially those born after the Saddam era, are frustrated. They're tired of corruption, sectarianism, foreign influence, and yes, that includes Iran. In 2019, massive protests erupted in Iraq. Thousands of youth took to the streets demanding change. And you know what happened? Iranian-backed militias were accused of killing protesters. That didn't sit well with the public. So, even though Iran still holds significant sway in Iraq's government and military infrastructure, public opinion is shifting. People are asking tough questions. Should a sovereign Iraq be dictated by decisions made in Tehran? Why are we constantly entangled in someone else's geopolitical chess game? And that brings us to now, the most recent developments. Just weeks ago, reports emerged that Iran has been transferring ballistic missiles and other heavy weaponry into Iraq. Not just to defend itself, but to prepare for possible future confrontations, maybe with Israel, maybe with the U.S., or maybe with regional rivals like Saudi Arabia. These moves aren't just defensive. They're strategic. They're signals. Iran knows that having deep roots in Iraq gives it a forward operating position, both militarily and politically. Iraq becomes a buffer zone, a pressure point, a launch pad. But that strategy has its risks. For one, Iraq is still struggling to stabilize itself. Its economy is fragile. Its political landscape is fragmented. And now, it's being used as a proxy stage for regional rivalries. This creates tension not just between Iran and Iraq's government, but between the Iraqi government and its own people. In fact, earlier this year, Iraq's prime minister publicly criticized Iran's interference in Iraqi affairs, a bold move, considering the behind-the-scenes power Tehran still wields. It was one of the clearest signals yet that Iraq wants to reassert its independence. And on the ground, the situation remains volatile. Drone strikes have become a common headline. U.S. troops stationed in Iraq are once again on high alert. Iranian-backed militias threaten retaliation every time Iran feels cornered, especially as sanctions and international pressure continue to weigh on Tehran. All of this creates a dangerous feedback loop. Iran wants to show strength to its enemies abroad and its citizens at home. Iraq wants sovereignty to govern itself, free from being anyone's puppet. And the U.S.? It's stuck trying to avoid another endless conflict while still protecting its assets in the region. And guess who suffers most in all of this? The people. The families trying to rebuild in Mosul. The kids growing up with drones overhead. The young activists whose protests are met with bullets. This isn't just geopolitics, it's personal. It's lived. And if you zoom out for a second, what's happening between Iran and Iraq right now isn't just about borders or old grudges. It's about influence, control, power. Iran doesn't need to launch a full-scale war to dominate Iraq. It already has deep roots through political allies, armed militias, and even economic entanglements. But that presence comes at a cost. Not just to Iraq, but to Iran too. Because here's the thing, Tehran's involvement in Iraq hasn't exactly made it popular in the region. While Iranian leaders see Iraq as a critical part of their regional strategy, part of what they call the axis of resistance that includes Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Assad regime in Syria, and the Houthis in Yemen, the people in those countries don't always agree. In Iraq especially, resentment is growing. The protests we saw in 2019 and 2020 weren't just about jobs or electricity, they were a loud rejection of foreign interference, especially from Iran. That's a huge shift. Just a decade ago, Iranian influence was seen as a stabilizing force against Sunni extremism. But now? Many Iraqis, particularly the younger generation, see Iran as part of the problem, not the solution. And that creates a very awkward tension for Iraq's leadership. On one hand, they rely on Iran-backed groups for security, political alliances, and even funding. On the other hand, they're under increasing pressure from their own citizens to push back against Iranian overreach. So what does the Iraqi government do? Well, they walk a tightrope. They try to balance both sides, keep Iran close enough to avoid chaos, but not so close that they alienate their own people. But in trying to please everyone, they often please no one. That's the heart of Iraq's current struggle, a constant tug-of-war between domestic legitimacy and foreign dependency. Now let's look at the security situation. It's fragile, to say the least. Every few weeks, there are reports of U.S. bases in Iraq or Syria being hit with rockets or drones, often traced back to Iranian-backed militias. The U.S. retaliates with airstrikes. Then Iran threatens revenge. And the cycle continues. It's like a geopolitical game of whack-a-mole, except the stakes are incredibly high. Civilians get caught in the crossfire. Economies take hits. And any small miscalculation could trigger something much worse. But what's even more dangerous is the ambiguity. Iran doesn't always take direct responsibility for these attacks. Instead, it uses proxy groups, militias with names that most people outside the region have never heard of. Groups like Kataib Hezbollah or Asaib al-Haq. These groups technically operate within Iraq but answer to Tehran. That gives Iran plausible deniability. We didn't order the attack, they say. It was a rogue group acting on its own. But everyone knows the game. These militias don't sneeze without a signal from Iran. And the U.S., while trying to avoid another endless war in the Middle East, is left in a tough position. Do they respond to every provocation? Do they risk civilian casualties with retaliatory strikes? Or do they hold back and risk looking weak? It's a no-win scenario. And Iraq, once again, becomes the arena for someone else's conflict. But here's something important, not every Iraqi militia is pro-Iran. In fact, there's been a recent rise in nationalist militias, groups that reject both American and Iranian influence. They want to build a new Iraq, free from foreign meddling. Some of these groups have even clashed with Iran-backed forces, sparking violence that barely gets covered in international media. This internal fragmentation, where militias fight each other as much as foreign targets, is tearing at the seams of Iraq's already delicate security structure. Imagine trying to run a country where multiple armed groups answer to different outside powers, and none of them fully obey the central government. That's Iraq right now. But despite all this chaos, there's something you can't ignore: resilience. The Iraqi people have endured decades of war, sanctions, invasions, and foreign interference. Yet they continue to fight, not with guns, but with protests, with journalism, with art, with elections. They've shown the world that they're not just victims, they're agents of change. And that's something Iran, and the rest of the region, has to reckon with. Because the future of Iraq won't just be shaped in Tehran or Washington, it'll be shaped in Baghdad, Basra, and Mosul. On the ground. By the people. The question is, will the governments listen? Will the militias loosen their grip? Will Iran realize that soft power has limits, that influence earned through fear eventually sparks rebellion? Or will the cycle continue, more rockets, more retaliation, more innocent lives lost in the name of strategy? As we move forward, keep your eyes on one key detail: how Iraq manages its next set of elections. Why? Because these elections will be a litmus test. A reflection of how much control Iran still holds and how much pushback is growing from inside. If nationalist, anti-corruption parties gain traction, it could signal a major shift. If pro-Iran factions tighten their grip, expect more protests and possibly more violence. Either way, the outcome will ripple far beyond Iraq's borders. It'll influence how the U.S. recalibrates its role in the region. It'll shape how Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries approach Iran. And it might just redefine what influence looks like in the Middle East in the next decade. And speaking of regional dynamics, there's another layer to all of this: Israel. Iran's growing influence in Iraq isn't just a concern for Baghdad or Washington, it's got Tel Aviv watching closely. Why? Because Iraq, especially its western regions, could serve as a strategic launching ground for Iranian missiles or proxy operations targeting Israel. In fact, some reports suggest that Iran has been positioning advanced weapons in Iraq specifically for this purpose. It's not just about defending itself anymore, it's about extending reach, creating deterrence, and sending a very clear message: we can hit back, from anywhere. That escalation potential is what keeps military analysts up at night. Because let's say Israel strikes one of these weapons depots in Iraq, something it's done before in Syria. What happens then? Does Iran retaliate directly? Does Iraq get dragged into a conflict it didn't sign up for? Or do Iranian-backed militias launch attacks, igniting a broader war by proxy? None of those scenarios end well. And yet, the groundwork for each of them is being quietly laid right now. Meanwhile, the global community watches, but hesitates to act. The United Nations issues statements. European nations urge de-escalation. But no one seems willing or able to break the cycle. The U.S. is cautious, burned by 2 decades of involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. Russia is distracted with Ukraine. China is busy making deals but staying out of direct military entanglements. So Iraq, once again, is left to manage a crisis largely on its own. And Iran? It continues playing a long game, embedding itself in Iraq's institutions, building loyalty through patronage, and keeping its adversaries guessing. But here's the truth: that strategy, while effective in the short term, might be planting the seeds of long-term instability, not just for Iraq, but for Iran itself. Because as much as Tehran wants to project strength, it's facing mounting pressure at home. Economic sanctions have strangled its economy. Youth unemployment is sky-high. Dissatisfaction is growing, especially among younger Iranians who are tired of living in isolation and fear. So the regime needs victories, or at least the appearance of strength abroad, to distract from problems at home. That's why Iraq matters so much to Iran right now. It's not just about politics, it's about survival. Maintaining influence in Iraq allows Tehran to claim regional relevance, to stand up to the West, and to prove it's still a major player. But Iraq isn't sitting idle. Despite the chaos, there are efforts being made to reclaim sovereignty. Iraqi lawmakers have started pushing legislation to limit foreign troop presence, both American and otherwise. The government has attempted to rein in militia activity, even if only partially. And civil society is becoming more vocal than ever. The internet has given young Iraqis a voice, and they're using it. On TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube, they're calling out corruption, exposing abuses, and challenging the status quo. This digital generation isn't afraid of Iran, or the U.S., or anyone else. They want jobs, freedom, and dignity. And they're tired of watching their country be used as a chessboard. That's where real hope lies, in the people. Because while governments and militias play power games, the people are building something different. Grassroots movements, independent journalism, community projects, all under the radar, but all critical to reshaping Iraq's future. So what's the bottom line? The Iran-Iraq dynamic in recent days isn't a simple story of good guys versus bad guys. It's messy, complicated, human. It's about a country trying to find itself while being pulled in every direction by neighbors, superpowers, and its own fractured identity. Iran isn't going away, and neither is U.S. influence. But Iraq has a choice: continue being the battlefield for other nations' ambitions, or rise up and define its own path. That won't be easy. It might take years, even decades. But every protest, every vote, every demand for accountability is a step toward something new. In the end, the question isn't whether Iran and Iraq will fight again in some traditional war, it's whether Iraq can survive the war of influence being waged inside its borders every single day. And more importantly, can it come out stronger, more united, and truly independent on the other side? Only time will tell. But one thing's for sure, what's happening now between Iran and Iraq isn't just history repeating, it's history evolving. And the world would be wise to pay attention. Because the story of Iraq and Iran isn't just about the Middle East, it's about how power, resistance, and identity shape the fate of nations everywhere.